Moving by Robert Eastland, read by Julian Clary.
Why should I have moved? I didn't want to move. They had no right to ask me to move. At first, I thought they were joking when they offered me a new council house in a different part of town. I didn't want to live in a different part of town, I told them. I didn't care that this council project was condemned. It was my home. It had been for years. They weren't unpleasant about it, the people from the council, not at first anyway. They couldn't believe that I liked living on Marlborough Court. Surely I'd have been glad to get out to the suburbs. Nearly all the other residents had signed without a second thought. I have to admit that Marlborough Court was not everything its designers had envisaged. The 8-storey tenements had been built in the 60s, part of the great architectural dream to restore the decayed neighbourhoods and accommodate everyone in a decent new housing. Each project was built in a horseshoe shape, with a sort of courtyard in the middle, complete with parking and kiddies' play equipment. On each one, a great Gothic archway provided access to the outside world. It must have looked impressive on the drawing board. But that was an old story. By the time they asked me to move, rubbish and burned-out cars littered the courtyard. Most of the units were empty, and graffiti ran riot over the doors and boarded windows. It was a nightmare. But it was still my home. I am a single man, and I kept myself to myself. I lived with a little spaniel called Poppy, and the two of us found Marlborough Court an ideal sanctuary to be tucked away in. Nobody bothered us, and we bothered nobody else. Eventually, of course, the council people got a bit bored with all this, and said that if I wouldn't accept any other house or flat, they'd have to evict. The whole estate was being bulldozed for a brand new intersection to ease traffic congestion on the city's chaotic road network. It was vital for the community of the city as a whole, and one selfish man was not going to stop it. I was still determined to stay. I would fight them, I said. I found out that one other resident had the same idea, a Mr. Mulqueeny, who lived on the ground floor opposite. He was an OAP and a former Grenadier Guard. Things might have been easier for me in this respect. Mr. Mulqueeny didn't like me much, and even though I went to see him several times with legal documents and such, he sat grumpily in his chair, arms folded, speaking only tersely, and never offered me a cup of tea. Our relationship ended completely a few days after the last of the other residents moved out. By this time, I think I was really irritating Mr. Mulqueeny, and when I went down to see him with some petition forms and took Poppy with me because it was time for her walk, he finally swore at me and told me to get the damn brute out of his house. He'd had enough, he shouted. After that, I felt very lonely. I was 3 stories up and found Marlborough Court a big, echoing canyon. Entire days passed without me ever seeing anyone. I stood on the balcony outside my front door, looking down into the courtyard, where litter was blowing about like tumbleweed, and not hearing a single sound. Yet there we were, in the heart of a thriving city. All that was to change the next night, however, when someone started to kick a football against my front door. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Then I woke up properly and lay there, rigid, cuddling Poppy. It came as a repeated heavy thump, every half-minute or so. I knew it was a football because I could hear it bouncing about on the concrete after each impact. Then the sound of feet scampering about, trying to get it under control again. I didn't dare look out and lay there for several hours after it had stopped, unable to sleep. I was so afraid. Then it occurred to me that as it was only 5 feet from my front door to the balcony wall, it could surely not have been a football. How could anyone have managed that in so narrow a space? It must have been something else. At dawn, I found the courage to glance out, but the first thing I saw, sitting on the deserted walkway outside, was an old football, a red and white Slazenger, the dry leather riddled with cracks. I slammed the door on it and only peeped out again several hours later. By then it had gone. Around lunchtime that day, a man came to see me. He was a huge man, clad in a stiff black suit and wearing black leather gloves. He told me his name was Mr. Balfager, and that he represented the private concern who had won the contract to build the new intersection. His company weren't really happy about waiting for an eviction case, he said, and wondered what the problem was. I felt that honesty was the best course of action. I told him that I thought private enterprise was one of the great ills of the Western world, particularly when it meant playing a numbers game with people's lives, and that if my refusal to see my home crushed into rubble was interfering with their cash flow, then I was sorry, but it was not my prime concern. He seemed to accept that, but warned me in the politest possible terms that the new intersection would be built, whether I liked it or not. That night was the most frightening of my life. It first started about 10 o'clock, when Poppy became agitated. She began to yelp and hid under my coffee table, refusing to come out. Then I heard it. It was very distant, possibly across the courtyard on one of the opposite balconies. It sounded as if someone was rattling the door handle to one of the flats very violently. I tensed. It was a sound anyone who'd grown up in the part of town I had would know well, the sound of a break-in. It could herald anything, from a harmless tramp seeking a roof for the night to a maniac bent on theft and murder. That was when another door began to rattle in a different part of the project. Then another, and another. The door on the empty flat next to mine began to shake as well. I shrank back into my armchair, reaching slowly for the telephone. A second later, it seemed that every door on the project was banging and rattling. The row was deafening, almost like thunder in the very fabric of the building. The floor seemed to vibrate under my feet. I'm terrified by violence and curled up into a helpless ball, hardly daring to look up. But I would not be bullied, I told myself repeatedly. I would not be. Then abruptly it stopped. Silence fell on the estate like thick dust. I listened out for a moment, then hurriedly picked up the phone and called the police. Just as hurriedly, however, I replaced it again. What could I say to them? That an army of burglars had descended and tried to break into every unit, all at the same time? I spent another sleepless night, huddled under my quilt. Poppy was equally restless, constantly trotting to the front door, sniffing around its base and growling, as though there was someone or something just on the other side of it. The next morning, I went round to see Mr. Mulqueeny. Despite his dislike of me, I had to talk to him. I was wondering if I was starting to imagine things, if the sheer faces of empty tower blocks on all sides and the empty wind-blown corridors were starting to take their toll. He didn't answer his door, however. When I looked in through the window, I saw him sitting up, staring directly at me, his face white as milk and fixed in a ghastly expression. His hands had clawed, the fingers sunk into the arms of the chair. I have seen death before. I nursed my mother through 6 years of terminal cancer, so I was not unduly upset by it. Admittedly, his posture was horrifying, but there is no pretty picture of death. Then I saw the faces. All over his window, etched into the dust, were faces, as clear as fingerprints, detail for detail, all twisted horribly, eyes clenched shut, mouths agape, as if shrieking. Dozens and dozens of them, covering every foot of the window, pressed tightly in. That was almost too much for me. I ran back to my own flat. On the way up, I fancied I could hear someone coming after me, great hammering feet which sounded in the echoing stairwell like hooves clopping. I made it safely back, however, and called the police. I didn't go back down to the courtyard until I saw a patrol car pulling in under the archway 10 minutes later. None of the officers were very sympathetic. It was obviously a heart attack, they said, and when they examined the window, they found no imprints of faces, fingers, or in fact anything else. Their final word to me was that it was foolish to hang on in a place like this. It was with a complete and final air of desolation that afternoon that I watched them take the old soldier's body away in a hearse. Then council workmen began to nail his property up. I was alone, apart from Poppy. At least, that was what I thought, until I went back inside and found that she wasn't there anymore. I spent much of the evening roaming about the deserted lots, shouting her name. Not once, though, did a joyful bark or yelp come back to me. Nowhere, among the strewn rubbish or overturned bins, did a small brown spaniel look up, its tongue hanging out and docked tail wagging. I went back to my flat when it got dark. With most of the street lights broken, night came quickly on Marlborough Court, surging in through the archways like the sea. I sat there for hours, feeling sorry for myself. I must have nodded off, however, for it was after midnight when I suddenly jerked awake. At first I wondered what had disturbed me, then I heard it, a faint yipping sound. I leapt to my feet. It was Poppy. I would recognise her anywhere. I listened for a moment and heard her again. Now she sounded agitated. She was obviously trapped somewhere, but where? Minutes passed, and finally I was drawn down onto my hands and knees. The yelping was coming from under my own floorboards, or rather, the empty flat beneath them. I hurried for my coat and shoes and went outside. It occurred to me fleetingly that this might be unwise, but I shrugged it off. I walked along to the top of the first stairwell. It was utterly dark down there, and so quiet you could have had a pin drop. In fact, it was like that all over the estate. Behind me, the courtyard was a virtual abyss. I picked my way down the steps, all the same, turned the corner at the bottom and walked along the balcony. I came to the flat under mine and found that although corrugated iron had been fitted over the windows, somebody had wrenched the door ajar. It didn't surprise me. I couldn't see any other way for Poppy to have got in. I listened for a minute. Now there was no sound from her. Eventually, softly, I called her name. Still, I heard nothing. She'd either come out again or was so badly hurt that she couldn't move. There was nothing for it. I'd have to go in. I found it musty and damp inside and thought I could hear a dry, rustling sound like old paper. It was too dark to see anything well, and I fumbled my way down the first passage. The floor had been scattered with shells or something. With every step it crunched under my feet. I checked in the first room, but again I couldn't see anything. I was sure that if Poppy had been anywhere in the apartment, I'd have heard her whining or panting by now. The suspicion grew on me that not only was she not there, but that she never had been. That faint rustling noise was still around, but it wasn't like any sound a dog might make. In fact, it was starting to seem familiar to me in an obscure way. I looked in the next room, my feet still crunching on things. It was as if someone had scattered crisps or breakfast cereal all over the place. This room would have been the largest in the flat. I knew this because mine had the same layout. I saw that one of the metal sheets had come loose on the window and that orange lamplight was shafting in onto the carpet. It was a carpet which seemed to be moving. My hair prickled. I looked closer. My crunching footsteps, the dry rustling, all easily explained now, because the floor was swarming with cockroaches. And I mean swarming. They were scuttling all over each other, a twitching, twittering mass of antennae and shiny, chitinous bodies. I remember blundering to the wall, my feet grinding them, sliding in their pulp. I was too sick with horror even to think straight. Now they were running over my feet, back and forth, with horrible speed. I reached out for the mantelpiece, but something jumped onto my hand from it, then scurried up my arm. I swatted it off. Next, something ran up the back of my leg. My response was simply to run. I didn't know where to. I just did, clawing wildly at myself, screams locked in my throat. I skidded and crashed into the window. The loose shutter fell off completely and light flooded the hellhole. A living tide rose about my feet, black and pulsating. There weren't thousands of them, I realized. There were millions. This wasn't infestation. This was a plague. Then one dropped past my face. I looked slowly up. Dear God, they were on the ceiling, twitching and scuttling in the cracks, thickly clustered in the corners, dripping down around me. At one side of the room, the paper had fallen away in strips, and an endless river of them flowed up the wall and through the exposed rafters, under the floorboards of the flat above. My flat. I staggered outside, still screaming silently, violently beating myself to knock the crawling devils off me. Then I was violently ill, all over the walkway. It took me several minutes to recover, but when I did, I had no intention of going back to my flat. Not after that. I couldn't face that. It was hardly fair of them, really. Fighting me that way, knowing all about my mother's little house and the creatures which shared it with us, dashing about under the sink and cooker, under the cupboards and beds, in the wardrobes and drawers. God, not that, never that. And so I set off, there and then on foot, just walking out of Marlborough Court with only the clothes I was standing up in. I was almost clear of the courtyard when I heard a distant, delighted shouting somewhere behind me, as though from several voices. They were guttural and coarse, and now whooping with glee. I turned and saw flames rising in a huge skip. Figures were standing around it, stoking the blaze. Up above them, on the third balcony, on my balcony in fact, other shapes were moving back and forth, hurling items down, but setting each one on fire first. My possessions. My furniture, my books, records and clothes, even Poppy's basket, flung down one after another in a burning deluge, crashing noisily onto the bonfire. As it rose higher into the night, the triumphal shouts and screams rose with it. I felt too sick and weary even to say anything, and walked on. I'd passed under the arch, crossed the road and was halfway through the next set of empty tenements when I finally stopped again. I couldn't be bullied, I told myself. I shouldn't be. It wasn't right. I went back to the road and stared through the archway. I could see firelight leaping on the blank walls and doors of the courtyard. It would have to be the bravest moment of my life. I started to cross. And I never knew where the big vehicle came from. It just seemed to sweep up out of the night, hitting me side on with terrible force, turning me over in mid-air, then flinging me down again like a broken doll. The road surface was cold and hard against my body. It smelled of oil and dirt. I remember the vehicle coming to a halt somewhere in front of me, its engine chugging, then the feet of the driver as he came and stood beside me. I could see him looking down, not too concerned. It's funny how you can tell that sort of thing from the posture of somebody's feet, from the sort of shoes they wear. These were heeled, pointy-toed boots, all buckles and leather straps. They could have been anyone's boots, I suppose, anyone who was out late and wanted to get home so badly that he wasn't watching the road, but they still looked like the sort of boots which might make a clopping noise in an old concrete stairwell. A moment later they climbed back into the vehicle and drove casually away. Sometimes they let me out of the hospital, though I can't get around very easily on my own. Recently, we went on a day trip in a minibus and drove through the city. It was hot, and we were soon tired and irritable. It's hard to get comfortable at the best of times, when you're as incapacitated as I am now, but in those cramped, sticky conditions. It got even worse when we came to the brand-new intersection where Marlborough Court once stood. Only one wall of the flats was still standing, and this was soon to be demolished. Bits of wallpaper were visible on it, and here and there the stumps of metal girders stuck out. I gazed up at it, and was astonished to see Mr. Belfager standing on the very top, as if to get an overview of the things he had created. I wouldn't have thought it was possible for anyone to get up there, but he had, and judging by the big grin on his face, what he was seeing made him feel very proud. I look about me, though, and I still think I was right. I didn't want to move, and if only they hadn't forced me to. It's so ironic, with log jams of cars now running into each other from every which way, trailing off down subways or up over the flyovers, meeting head-on in the middle, on the numerous traffic islands and T-junctions, coming in from all directions and levels, the whole thing gridlocked and pumping out noise and pollution all day. Well, now nobody's moving at all.